Hi everyone, welcome back to Ben Reads Good. We've taken a big old leap into February, and so it's time to look back at what I read last month. January's always a bit of a weird month for me. I find it dark and cold, and you've not got Christmas to look forward to. And in amongst all that, everyone is trying to tell you how they're going to make themselves an even better person this year. And it's really not my vibe. It just fills me with existential dread about the passage of time. So am I sad to see the back of January? No, not really. It just feels like a hangover, and I don't really like it. That said, I had a pretty glorious reading month. I read 5 books in total, these 4 plus one that I read on Kindle, and I found some really great reads in there. I was hoping to also finish Still Life by Sarah Winman, which I'm currently about 85% of the way through. But I didn't quite finish it before the end of the month, and I didn't want to rush it because it's a really gorgeous novel that I want to savour. Moving on to the books that I did actually read in January though, and I know conventional wisdom says to start the year with a few short books, get some under your belt, build momentum, get ahead of your goals. I didn't do that at all. I read Richard Powers' The Overstory as my first read of the year, which is a 600-page epic, but I'm so glad I did read it because it is magnificent and an instant favourite for me. This is the second book by Richard Powers that I've read. I read Bewilderment a few years ago, which was a finalist for the Booker Prize but lost out to Damon Galgut's The Promise. But I absolutely loved that. It was a beautifully written depiction of a father-son relationship, and it just broke my little heart. This is a much bigger, more sweeping work, and it covers a pretty large cast of characters and their relationships to trees and to the natural world and to each other. It's told in a few distinct parts, the first of which takes up maybe the first third of the book and reads a bit like short stories, introducing these characters, giving their histories, setting their contexts, before, in the final 2/3 of the book, bringing those characters together in really interesting ways. I'm not going to say too much about why I loved this book because I would like to do a dedicated video to it. I think it deserves that closeness of attention, but I absolutely loved it. It's a really magnificent, sweeping, epic, beautifully written novel. If this sets the tone for what my 2023 reading is going to be like, then I'm going to be a very happy guy because it's just fantastic. The second book I read this month was We Had to Remove This Post by Hanna, Bervoets, translated by Emma Rault. This was originally published in Dutch, and it's a really short novel, very different in size to The Overstory. It tells one very short story and arguably does not tell it completely. We follow our protagonist Kaylee as she gets a job at a third-party contractor for a social media company, definitely not Facebook, which is enlisted to conduct content moderation. Kaylee and her co-workers see all sorts of messed up stuff, and they have to decide whether that content can stay on the platform or needs to be removed. And they have to do it using these really detailed, complex, multi-layered rules that cover both the content and the intent of the poster. I found the writing really engaging. I thought it was a nicely written, funny, acerbic book. The book really skewered the Kafkaesque bureaucratic nightmare that I'm sure has a lot of truth to it behind the scenes at some of these social media companies. And it was really interesting to see what the impact of seeing all this content had on Kaylee and her colleagues, because it really messed some of them up. There were also some queer romance elements to it, which is always a bonus, but it's with a heavy heart that I give this but. It really just finished in a random place. It seemed like Hanna Bervoets got to a point in the story and just closed her laptop, and then it got published. The story literally ends at one of the points of highest drama in the whole book. And when you're reading on Kindle like I did, it makes it all the more bizarre because I had no sort of physical signals that I was coming to the end of the book. So that was a shame, really. I still gave it 4 stars, but I wish it were twice as long. The next book I read was one that I picked up in the Waterstones hardback sale just after Christmas, and it's Mohsin Hamid's The Last White Man. This is a lovely signed copy. This is the second book I've read by this author. I read Exit West a while ago, and that's a fantastic book. I gave that 5 stars. And it's this magical realist metaphor for immigration where portals open up between different countries, and it sort of throws the traditional orders of who can go where really into disarray. Essentially a big grand thought experiment. This novel, The Last White Man, is another magical realist experiment where we follow a character called Anders who wakes up one morning and he's no longer white, but he is brown. It turns out this is not just happening to Anders, and it doesn't just happen the once. this phenomena spreads throughout his community and starts spreading throughout the world. And over the course of the novel, we explore sort of how that impacts society, how it breaks down the traditional hierarchies, how it impacts personal relationships between people who thought they knew each other but no longer feel like they do. I somewhat liked this novel. I enjoyed the ideas and the way that Mohsin Hamid explored them, but there were a couple of things that just didn't quite work for me. For one thing, I didn't massively enjoy the prose in this novel. It's full of long run-on sentences that are often a paragraph in length. And at first I thought, oh, this is a switch up for Mohsin Hamid. I don't remember the last novel being like this. And I did open on a random page in Exit West and it was written in a similar style. And that really surprised me because I don't remember that being a feature of that book. But that tells me that the form of that book really worked well with the plot and the narrative. In this novel, however, I really did notice it. And that tells me that it didn't work quite so well. I think it really would have benefited from being written with sort of more traditional sentence structure. I also found it interesting that there was really not much representation of actual black and brown people who were not previously white in this book. Mohsin Hamid has said that he was just exploring an idea and it's not really his intention to be judgmental or authoritative about race. And while what he has done is absolutely fine, I just think there's a missed opportunity there. There's a really interesting perspective that could have been explored more, but just wasn't. Overall, it was an all right read for me. I still want to go back and read The Reluctant Fundamentalist because I've heard that's fantastic, but I won't be rushing back to this one anytime soon. The next book I read was Michelle Zauner's Crying in H Mart, which I'm sure will be very familiar to many of you out there. This is also a signed copy, which I picked up from Rough Trade, the record store. You might know Michelle Zauner as Japanese Breakfast. I don't know if she counts as a solo act or if Japanese Breakfast are a band, but they make modern pop music and it's really good stuff. This is Michelle Zauner's memoir of her experience of her mother's diagnosis with pancreatic cancer and her sad death a few years later. And at the heart of this memoir is food and Michelle Zauner's connection to her mother and her culture through Korean food. She doesn't have the easiest, most warm relationship with her mother, but I think that makes some of the more tender moments even more poignant and touching. Cancer really is a punishing disease, not just for the person who gets it, but for those all around them. And this was a heartbreaking account of its impact on a family. It never felt manipulative, but it was unflinchingly honest, and it really sort of choked me up at moments. If you somehow haven't read this already, and it feels like the whole internet has, I'd really highly recommend it. Finally, last month, I read The Sound of Things Falling by Juan Gabriel Vasquez, translated from Spanish by McLean. This is a book from Colombia and was actually one that I got a recommendation to read from ChatGPT, the AI chatbot. I've done a whole video on my experience of getting a book recommendation from ChatGPT, which I'll link in the description below. I asked for recommendations for some well-written novels under 300 pages that I might not have heard of. This was one of the recommendations and I hadn't heard of it, and I gave it a go. This book's about a Colombian law professor called Antonio Yamara, who befriends a sort of enigmatic man called Ricardo, who listens to a strange tape and then is murdered. And Antonio gets really obsessed with why did this murder happen? And if this sounds like a thriller, it's not a thriller. This is a really pretty literary, introspective, layered, deep novel that actually takes quite a lot of brain power to read. I really enjoyed this book though. I don't know too much about Colombian history, or didn't before I read this book, but Vasquez uses the relationship between Antonio and Ricardo as a bit of a proxy to explore wider Colombian society and the impact of the drug trade on the people of Bogota. I do have to put out a small content warning for anyone out there like me who is not a fan of flying, that The Sound of Things Falling does refer to aeroplanes, and I will let you read into that what you will and decide if this is a book for you. That said, it didn't horrify me or disturb me too much. I did enjoy reading it. I just think it is worth knowing going into it that there's some air disaster related stuff. So yeah, that's everything I read in January. A really good start to the year, and if that's not my favourite month, then boy, are we in for a good 2023 of reading. I would love to hear if you read any absolute gems in January, or if you've got anything coming up in February that you're really excited to read about. Let me know in the comments. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like, and if you fancy seeing more of my content, hit subscribe. Until next time, Toodles.